So now this is the second part of our discussion of what we would call the grocer's ledger, right? And how trustworthy is a person when he produces his ledger and says, "You owe me money." Ube'er hadavar be'edya habe'er etef sham. He quotes one of the poskim, one of the commentators on the Shulchan Aruch, and he says, "Kol ze בפנקס המחייב את עצמו, אבל לא מחייב את חברו, דלחיובי דידי מהנה, ולא לחיוב חברו." He says, all this that we said, we just, read this halakha in Choshen Mishpat, that one can even take money, make the orphans pay based on the ledger. It says, if you are mechayev et atzmo, if the person wrote, "I owe money to someone," but not if you write, "Someone owes me money." Why would I trust that? Here, what kicks in is something that we call hoda'at ba'al din k'mea edim dami. Self-incrimination is as if you had 100 witnesses. And even though 100 witnesses in halakha is the same as 2 witnesses, it's good for the case of witnesses being disqualified. So the rabbi said, if you incriminate yourself, it's like 100 witnesses, meaning that if you had 100 witnesses, even if 98 of them are disqualified, you still have 2 witnesses, meaning it's very hard to disprove after you yourself admitted that you owe money to someone. So what the original halakha that we read about raglaim ladavar is that if someone passed away without organizing, without making sure that someone knows all of his financial matters, and then among his objects we find this booklet or ledger where it says, "I owe money to such and such," then his children, the children of that person, even though they're orphans, must pay the creditor. Because then, and of course, if we assume that he had a good, that what is written there is true. But not if you write that someone else owes you money. It only works for the person who sort of incriminates himself, and not the other. Yotzel lefize. So according to that, afilu henvani she'umanuto be'akafot, even though this grocer runs his business all based on this credit system, v'kotev hakol bedikduk, and he writes everything meticulously, ve'no mera' umanuto, and we assume that he does not want to create bad reputation. So even though we have some arguments in his favor, afilu achei, kol ze lo mehane lotzi mamon bishva. With all that, it is not enough to take money away to make the defendant pay, even if the plaintiff takes an oath. Acharei divrei ha'emet ve'atzedek ha'ele, says once we've clarified clearly what is it that the Talmud says regarding the grocer's ledger, מיותר לנו אפוא להיכנס לבירור עם הרשימות שהוגשו לפנינו על דפים תלושים של חוברת שהתובעת רשמה עליהם ההקפות, דינם כדין פנקס מבורר. He says we don't even have to go into the discussion whether those sheets are reliable, but it's interesting the way he phrases it. הרשימות הוגשו לפנינו על דפים תלושים של חוברת. They were torn pages from a ledger, the original ledger where the purchases were written. And he says we cannot even compare it to a pinkas mevorar, because this is not his argument. One, maybe the plaintiff argued that this is not strong enough because it's only torn pages. He says this is not the point, whether the pages were torn, where it's the full ledger, that then what argument would apply? Hazaka uman lo mera umanuto. We see another sort of like what people call meta halachic argument. We have just as we saw before. This kind of hazaka is an interesting concept. Hazaka, it literally means, we understand from the word hazak, right? Strong, but it's not related to the word strong. What other word in Hebrew that comes from this verb, het zayin kuf, and it doesn't mean strong, even though it's connected somehow? When we think of the infinitive of that term. What is the infinitive of hazak? to, how do you say it in Hebrew? The infinitive meaning the name of the action. What would be the name of the action if you take it from the word hazak? Lehazek, right. So sorry, lehazek is in pi'el. B'mishkal kal, or le'af'il. What will le'af'il? B'mishkal le'ahzik. Hif'il is le'ahzik. So interesting, right? Le'ithazek ze hitpa'el in binyan hif'il, it will be le'ahzik. Le'ahzik is to hold on to something. So it is connected because, like in the English we say that actually in the same word, stronghold, right? To hold on to something means that you have the strength. But in Hebrew there are two nuances of that verb. But the word hazak means that someone is holding on to something, and we mean that there is it's sort of like cumulative evidence that not necessarily comes from the behavior of one person, but could come from like big data, what we call today, that shows a pattern of behavior. So, for example, the hazakah is used when we speak of an ox, a goring ox. The famous goring ox of Mishpatim, right? That the Talmud speaks about the innocent, or the ox with the clean record, and the shor mu'ad, which has the hazakah, which has the pattern of goring people. So they say if an ox gored once and twice, he's already has the hazakah, he has the pattern of being a goring ox, and we know that he's going to do it again. So if the owner did not restrain him, it's the owner's fault. In the same manner, there's another sort of like subcategory of hazakah, which is the sort of like a negative hazakah, lack of argument. Meaning, if someone which might have called a squatter entered a house and lived there for 3 consecutive years. Now, the owner of the house appears in court and says, "The house is mine." The squatter says, "No, the house is mine. You sold it to me." It doesn't say I'm a squatter. If you said that you didn't say anything, then he admits that he doesn't own the house, and the owner could get him out. But if he says you sold it to me, and the owner says, "Okay, where is the document?" He says, "I lost the document." The Talmud says it's okay. You don't have to give your document after 3 years, because we have a hazakah. We have this idea of you are holding into a property. If it wasn't yours, the owner would have come earlier and say, "Get out of my property." Another example of hazakah, which has to do with neighbors. Let's say I have let's say that me and Boke are neighbors, and I decided to open a business of smoked meat. Okay, so I prepared the smoked meat in my backyard every day. For a year, I'm smoking meat there, and all the smoke goes into his house. He says nothing. Then one day he comes and say, "That's it. I cannot take it anymore." I would be able to say, under certain circumstances, since I've been running it for a while, and you didn't complain, I have a pattern. So we've established an agreement. This is like because it happened day after day, and meaning you had enough opportunities to repeal that, and you didn't. So that is the cause of hazakah. So we saw hazakah before also with when we discussed the idea of modeh b'miktzat, taking an oath when you admit only part of the debt. And we said hazakah en adam me'iz panav bifnei ba'al chovo. We says we have this kind of hazakah that one cannot have such chutzpah or such ingratitude towards his creditor, right? So this is not unlike the other hazakot that I mentioned before, which are a cumulative pattern of the same person or the same ox or the usage of the same house. Here we're talking about a pattern that emerges from observing people, many people. Like you say, if we look at at the the average person, or we say most people, would not do such a thing. That's another form of hazakah. So here, this is a very important concept when we talk about. It even applies to the laws of kashrut, but mainly in monetary issues we have this kind of hazakah, and this is hazakah uman lo merea or lo mara in Aramaic. Uman lo mara umanuto, right? Why do we say uman? What is uman lo mara umanuto? A craftsman would not do something that would harm his reputation as in that specific craft, because then he's going to lose his business. So this, for example, applies to kashrut as well. For example, in the laws of kashrut, if we have a mixture of meat and dairy, the original way to decide whether the mixture is kosher or not was not to measure the proportion, 1 to 60 or 1 to 3, whatever it was, but rather to taste it. Because the whole idea is like a mixture of dairy and meat. If one flavor takes over the other flavor, it means that it disappeared, it was swallowed in the whole mixture. But if the flavor is still there, then we have a problem. Unfortunately, we cannot do it. We cannot taste the mixture, because if there is a dairy flavor, right, that would be a transgression. We should not have done that. So what do we do? So the halacha in the Yoreh De'ah, the Shulchan Aruch says, you can give it to a non-Jew to taste, and he will tell you whether it's dairy or not, and you could rely on him, right? So, so then an argument ensues among the commentators that should you inform that person? And when we talk about a non-Jew, they say kfela. It has to be a chef or someone like who understands in cooking, right? So the argument between the commentator is, are we going to tell that person we rely on you? Based on your verdict, we would define that dish as kosher or not, or should we not? We just say, what do you think of that? What flavor do you feel? In this dish. What do you think? Which commentary would you go with? Should he know? Should he be aware of that? I'm relying on his information, or I'm just giving him just randomly. This seems to be the agreement of the halacha, that you should inform him that you rely on his answer because he's a chef. So he doesn't want to damage his reputation. If he says it's not dairy and then you taste it and says, wow, it does taste a little buttery, then what kind of a chef are you that can't detect such flavor? And it's an extremely important halacha when it's like that, when it applies there, because this is why we could rely on federal regulations and on information divulged to us by certain store owners in the food industry, because they do not want to harm their reputation. So anyway, this is part of a whole system in halacha, which is how would we say, it's hard to pin down to details like one by one, but it's cumulative. When you look at the behavior patterns of people, you could say, okay, this is how people behave. Right? We always have an outlier. You could always have one person who behaves differently, right? But you need proof to show that he's an exception, to show that he's an outlier. So, anyway, Rabbi Waldenberg concludes this discussion by saying that once we've clarified that the maxim in the Talmud of the grocer's ledger is trustworthy only applies when I asked the grocer specifically for a certain product, and I told him charge me for it. He also clarifies that the case in the Shulchan Aruch and Choshen Mishpat, that the person who the ledger of the deceased is trustworthy, it's only when he says that he owes money to others and not the other way around. And therefore he goes on to say that even though that is the profession of the plaintiff, and we would have wanted to argue that she would not damage her reputation by claiming by suing other people for money that they don't owe her. He says we don't have to go into that. We don't even have to go into the question of whether those torn pages are as important as the ledger itself. Why? Even if it were true that she is trustworthy, she doesn't want to change the to damage her reputation. The grocer is not trustworthy when the client says this is not true. והיה דינו לכל היותר רק כתביעת בריא בעל פה ושכנגדו מכחישו דמחייבו רק שבועה. It says, at maximum that we could put this lawsuit at is that when someone says, I know for sure that you owe me, it's called tviat bari. Bari here is from the word barur, clear. That is, I'm just adding for a second so you see the word bari v'shema. Those are the two concepts that the Talmud speaks about. The bari is confident, clear. Shema is maybe. So if a person says, I know 100% that you owe me money, and the other person says, I'm not sure, then the person who says, I'm confident that you owe me money will take an oath and will make the other one pay him. Because the other one said, I don't really remember. But if the other one, but if the other person says, this is not true, again, he would only take an oath. So now that was the first argument that the plaintiff brought against the defendant, and that is that we have the concept in the Talmud of the grocer's ledgers, which is trustworthy, and that has been repealed by Rabbi Waldenberg, saying this doesn't apply here because it was of a very specific case in the Talmud, and the ledger is trustworthy only when one makes incriminates himself, sort of. But now let us go to the other argument, which is that she should take an oath because she admitted part of the lawsuit. because she did admit in the example that I gave you, the full volume of her purchases was $1,000. The grocer sues her for $100. She says, I owe you $10. So here she fell into the category of modeh b'miktzat, a partial admittance, which we said before. You have to take an oath to show that you really saying the truth and not trying to hide behind a smaller lie. And he says, and he says, in this regard, there's really no dispute. Everybody agrees. And this really it goes in accordance with the halakha that a person who admits only a partial admittance would have to swear midoraita. So and the argument of the plaintiff is a bari one. It's a clear one, not ambiguous. She says, I'm clear on the fact that she allowed me to charge her for her credit and that she didn't pay me. So it seems almost that the conclusion of Rabbi Waldenberg would be that if the grocer takes an oath, we will trust her. Ulam, because it's a clear halacha in another place in Chosh Mishpat, 12:2. דאם חייבו בית דין שבועה לאחד מהם, רשאי בית הדין לעשות פשרה ביניהם כדי להיפטר מעונש שבועה. There's an interesting concept. That the Bedin already reaches the conclusion that one of the sides must take an oath. And but despite that, the Bedin now can intervene and say, listen, we don't want to put, we have the feeling that something is wrong here. Either one of you forgot, maybe one is lying, maybe you are in a situation that you would take the oath no matter what. And they're not saying it, but this is our mindset, right? Like, our mindset is, what if someone is lying, and that someone is a part of the minority that does not mind taking an oath, right? So what we'll end up doing two wrongs. One, depriving one person of his money, right? Either we'll make the defendant pay where she doesn't have to pay, or we'll let the plaintiff go away without being paid. And the second thing that we'll do, will cause someone to take a false oath, and we don't want to be the incentive to do that. And it says, umagam, so in order to do that, Rashai bet adin lasot pshara. Pshara means arbitration. It comes from the word pashar is, in Hebrew, posher, is between hot and cold. It's neither. So pshara is like, you're trying to get to a middle ground in order to avoid the severe punishment for taking a false oath on a shvuah. And here it's even worse because the obligation of the shvuah is biblical, not rabbinical. לכן יש להטיל פשרה בין הצדדים שגם כן דין הוא בחגון זה. It says, therefore we should come to an arbitration, which, as a matter of fact, is judgment, is verdict. Meaning, we're not avoiding a decision that is considered a decision. So, all in all, we saw several things in this whole discussion of Rabbi Waldenberg. First of all, we saw that this is a modern teshuvah, 20th century, using maxims taken directly from the Talmud, 2,000 years ago, and one of these argument, which is Henvani al Pinkaso, the grocer on the grocer's ledger, sort of was taken out of context by people, even by decisors of halacha, who sort of missed the original context, which, like we mentioned before, was when the Baal Habayit, or in this case the defendant, told his children or his employees to take something from the grocer. So this is what I would call an ossified concept, or a maxim that was taken out of the Mishnah and transported to other discussions without the whole system that supports it, that surrounds it. And with that, we have to be very careful. It is very common in less so in Jewish law, more common in non-legal literature, but we could see that. So we have to be careful with that. That is one thing. We saw how he uses other sources, the Choshen Mishpat and the commentaries on Choshen Mishpat, trying to make comparison to see where else do we have this concept of trusting one's ledger. And he came to the conclusion that we have in one case where someone passed away, and we say we trust it in order to incriminate only if he makes the statement that he owes money, but not if people owe to him. So then he threw in this concept of raglaim ladavar, that we need a reason to believe that the argument is true. And eventually, he says, he looks at certain things and said those are trivial to the discussion, the torn pages, etc. And it concludes that all this thing of the Grocer's ledger doesn't apply here, that you cannot trust her based on that. Then he says that in terms of shvuah, the defendant would have to swear, or the plaintiff would swear that she deserves that payment. But he says we would rather go with arbitration. Now, so the arbitration allows is it just to quiet the conscience of the decisor, or does it go beyond that? So this is a question that's hard to decide. But here I would like really to ask you Two questions. One is, did you ever run into a situation like that where people had some kind of a verbal agreement and then the other person comes and says, you didn't pay me, you owe me more money, and the other person says it's not true? And then I'll ask you the second question. Yes, Rebecca, you had a situation like that?
My dad used to sell restaurant equipment.
Uh-huh.
He had this happen more than once with a manager that worked for him for a time who would make deals with people for discounts. And then when he wasn't in the store and the person buying would come in and try and honor the discount, it was never written down anywhere. And usually it was for, the Boy Scouts or a school or something like that. And so my dad felt like he had to honor it for a nonprofit, but it caused a whole lot of problems.
Mm-hmm. So you think that, so in this case, someone, some of the clients argued that the manager offered a discount, but you never knew if the discount was offered or not.
Because what started happening is that other people would hear, well, if you go into the store and say so-and-so promised a discount, they have to give it to you.
Yes.
So
right.
Once that started happening, that's what created the problem.
Right. So it's interesting because here is like sort of like an unwritten agreement, even though that here your father could have said I'm not interested in that, or I never offered this discount. Nobody could have sued him. Nobody could say no. There's no agreement, but
he was worried about getting the reputation.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. So this is the case. That they would harm his reputation. This is a problem. This is no question. It's a problem that is related to that. But here's what we call davar masur lalev. It's really in the person's heart or the person's conscience that, or moral compass that would say this is not the right thing to do. To say you offered me a discount, right? I mean, your father, you knew from him personally when he came and told you that, as at home, you knew that he was right because he has no reason to tell you something that was not true. So that's an interesting story.
He solved it by creating a system because he liked to offer discounts to nonprofit groups, and so he actually created a system where if somebody was going to come back and purchase an item at discount, he created a special slip that one of his workers could give to the person. It had to have his signature on it, because a lot of times people didn't want to buy it on the spot. They wanted to go back and talk to whoever. Right. They had to bring back that coupon. Oh,
that okay. So he ended up with creating a document for that kind of verbal agreement. And
it wasn't a legal document. It wasn't like a bona fide coupon that was published and available.
Right. But that is interesting because this is exactly how documents came into being. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you look at the history of any document, today, you have LegalZoom and all this, you could buy certain pre-printed forms for certain transactions. When you rent or buy a house, you'll see all the paperwork. It's all contracts that came into being because people went through situations and had to write down things to cover up for. And sometimes you will see some dangling participles that you don't know where did they come from, and you realize it only comes to cover for a certain. Even the contract on the back of a baseball ticket, right? You go to watch a sports event, and it says that you cannot sue the management if you're hit by a ball, right? Is a result of someone being hit by a ball and then suing the stadium. So, but we have contracts all the time. You didn't sign the thing, but they tell you by purchasing the ticket, you do that. On the other hand, if you go to a place like Action Zone, like with kids doing climbing, rock climbing, stuff like that, they make you actually sign a sort of waiver because they had situations where people sued, even though it was printed. But all these things are really interesting when you look at the history of halacha. It's as very similar to the general law. And as a matter of fact, the rabbis recommended not to make transactions without witnesses. There was a famous story of a man who was traveling, and from town to town in antiquity, 200-300 years ago, where you didn't have banks, you carried cash with you, and he comes to a certain town, a little town, just before Shabbat. And he had money with him, he didn't know what to do, so he figured out that the rabbi would be a trustworthy person. So he went to the rabbi, he asked, where is the town's rabbi? He went to him and he says, here, I have my money, please can I deposit with you until after Shabbat? And he did so. So after Shabbat, he came to the rabbi and he claimed his money. He says, please give me back my money. The rabbi said, I don't know what you're talking about. I have never seen, I saw you, but you never gave me any money. And the man started crying. He's like, I cannot believe it. This is my money, my investment, my savings, whatever. And after a while, the rabbi said, here's the money. I just wanted to, I wanted to let you know that you should trust no one. Even the rabbi of the city, do not give money to people without witnesses, because you don't know what you're going to run into. So that being said, this is the next question that I wanted to ask you. Let's say we had no background or no knowledge of what the halakha says in such a case, right? And you have this question brought to you. Let's say you're in, small claims court, right? What would you say? How would you handle this case? What would be the argument in favor of any of the sides? The plaintiff says that it's on her ledger and that the defendant owes her money and it was not fully paid. Well, how would you handle it?
In American small claims court?
Yeah, in American, in Rebecca's or in Bookie's, like your own court. You were chosen as the judge or the arbitrator. What would you say?
Those might be two different questions. In American small claims court, a self-produced document saying so-and-so owes me money without that other person's signature or a notary or something like that, it wouldn't hold up.
Right, okay, so not small court. Like, let's say you're the judge and that's it. You have the discretion. This is the case in front of you.
Like you said, you'd have to consider the reputation of the store owner. Is this something that they do often? Have there been other accusations? I think you'd have to look back.
Right. I think that's a very logical argument, right? You have to see because you want to see if one of them is the exception. Like if that woman, the grocer handles hundreds of customers, and this is the only case where someone, where she has this kind of interaction, then you'd say maybe she's right. On the other hand, you could, if the defendant has other accusations against her with other people, then also would be approved. Still, it would not be able to prove the case, right? But it's like the raglayim ladavar. It would give sort of a weight towards one or other direction. Vuki, you have what would you do in this case?
Probably the same thing. You definitely have to look at the history.
Yeah.
You have to look at not just the trustworthiness of the grocer, but of the defendant as well. The way that Rav Waldenberg lays it out in terms of going to arbitration seems like the best course of action when you don't have much actual proof.
Mm-hmm.
I can't say I would do anything really different than that.
So eventually you would come to arbitration even without all this halakhi. It's interesting, all this halakhi discussion. And so on one hand, we favor the plaintiff, the defendant, because she's in we could say weakness position, right? On the other hand, what argument we could say in favor of the plaintiff to say that we would almost say she could claim the money without evidence. Let's say, what argument would we say? Let's say we assume we're not talking about crazy amounts of money, but we don't know. To each person, it's his own proportional perspective of what is a lot, what is a little. But I think there's an argument that you could say, even without this background of halakha, in favor of the plaintiff, is that. And it's related to what you said about reputation, is that she didn't ask to be paid credit. She could have demanded that everything would be paid cash. She did a favor to the customer, saying, I would give you the merchandise and you can pay me later. And then, with the same vein, we turn to the defendant and say, listen, you have agreed to trust the grocer, to trust the business owner without keeping track. I mean, if you had any suspicion, you should have kept track of all the receipts that were given, and then you could compare it. And also, when you make payments, to record exactly how payments were made. So I think that I would also, like you, would come to the conclusion at the end of the at the end of this deliberation to say, let us have a pshara, let us have an arbitration, but then warn the two parties that from now on, if they decide to follow in that pattern of getting merchandise for credit, to make sure that every transaction is clearly recorded. So if there's a dispute, they could compare the records and see who's right in that sense. Okay, so I think with that we'll conclude today. We have a couple more minutes, but